Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining the Clallam EC Coffee Chat, Coffee with Colleen. We appreciate you being here, and we really appreciate Josh Weiss, our lobbyist for the Clallam Economic Alliance, being here today in the last week of session to talk to us about what's been happening, what's probably going to happen going forward, and about some of the priorities that we as a group have put forward for him to help us achieve. So anyway, a few housekeeping items. If you would please keep yourself on mute so we don't pick up background noise. And if you have questions, either put them in the chat or alternatively raise your hand and we'll call on you. And I understand that my voice isn't coming through well, so I'll try to keep my comments to a minimum and let Josh take it away. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Colleen, and good morning, everyone. It's nice to see everyone. Yeah, we're down to tomorrow is the last day of legislative session that they're allowed to continue to work constitutionally. They do have until midnight tomorrow. It has been a kind of tumultuous session for a short year. We had heard early on that there was intention to do some major tax reforms, and they have in fact done that. But usually the short 60-day session, the supplemental budget year, second year of the biennium is when they essentially their big job is just to sort of do some maintenance and tweaking updates to their biennial budget. This year, that was further exacerbated by when we came into session, they thought they were going to have a really significant budget shortfall. And then by also the fact that there's been a lot of uncertainty with federal reductions and pauses on programs and impacts in the state from HR 1 at the federal level. So we knew it was going to be impactful, but I think it has been even more so than we expected. Um, so most people probably are aware that the House has now passed a version of the millionaire's tax income tax bill. They completed that yesterday about 6:15 in the afternoon, and they had started it at 5:30 the day before. So they went just a little more than 24 hours of continual debate on that. House Republicans have a very deep 10 vote um, minority in the House, and so there wasn't a way for them to actually stop the bill or even really shape it. But what they were able to do is make it extraordinarily painful for the majority Democrats, and that is what they did. Um, Ultimately, and I think that, we've seen this with this current last few years with this current Democratic leadership makeup that sometimes there's not the best. Sometimes they miscalculate about how long things are going to take or whether they have the votes for items. And so I think this was a little bit of a surprise. I've never seen them, I guess maybe only once or twice have I seen them work all the way through the night. Um, and it's very unusual. I've never seen them personally work for full 24 hours. So that has happened, and the House did amend the bill, and it will be going back to the Senate. The Senate will have to agree on the amendments. There's been a lot of news about how, it sounds like they've reached an agreement between not only the two chambers, but also with the governor. Governor Ferguson has said he would vote on this version of the bill. So there's there's still the plan. I think the majority's plan is to get a version that will be most likely to withstand citizen initiative. They are anticipating an initiative from the people, and then also stand up in the Washington Supreme Court, which has traditionally ruled that income is property. Um, there is rationale and thinking behind the majority's thinking about why they believe this will stand up, um, both in terms of um, public sentiment, but also in the Supreme Court. We'll be, I think, over the next couple of years, we'll be able to watch this and see whether or not they're right about that. Um, Part of they do have polling on public sentiment. Um, and I think that's pretty consistent with how we're seeing demographic changes in the state over the last probably significantly since COVID. That's been going on before, and just population growing in the Puget Sound area, and a lot of people coming in from out of states, which are already blue voters, and just strengthening the blue majority. So we'll see. One of the real tensions, if anybody, there's a uh, Substack post from an organization called the Observer, the Washington Observer, and they've been covering this discussion in the Democratic um, circles about whether or not the objective of this is to provide additional tax sufficiency, that is, additional revenue for the state budget that they can spend on programs that are important, or if it's about equity and regressivity. And the tension really inside the Democratic circles about which objective they're trying to meet. And it's different for different people. The governor very clearly put his foot down earlier on in session and said this has to be about regressivity. They want to be moving the state away from primarily sales tax, and which does impact lower income people more than higher income people. And we really do effectively, as any of you business owners know, we effectively have an income tax on businesses through the state B&O tax, which hits very hard. And so, the governor came in and really asked for, and the bill now includes a reduction for small businesses in the amount of revenue that a small business can make before they have to pay B&O tax. So there's a bigger exemption. Um, at the same time, the tax collects, the last estimate that we had, it has continued to change, but that I saw was about $4 billion a year. And that will begin to be collected in 2028. The revenue would come in 2029. And um, so they are planning on their budget is partially based in the out years of the budget forecast. It is based on some of that revenue coming in. Let's see. Uh, Tim Dalton asked about pressure in the 2026 election cycle. I will say that I mean it's always hard to predict, right, what the election cycle is going to look like. So take whatever I say next as with a major caveat footnote. I think traditionally the thinking has always been that you never want to take a tax vote in a short session before an election, that it's too close to what voters will remember, and that they'll punish you at the polls. I think what the state has shown in the last few years is that most voters are not, what's the right way to say this? They are more concerned about what they feel and see Republicans doing at the federal level, and anger in the state about what they see at the federal level. That is the overriding uh, issue when they get to the polls. So what the sort of traditional view, the Democrats are banking that traditional view is not going to carry forward. And they have certainly, that has held true over the last several years, right? Last session, they made significant sales tax increases, significant B&O tax increases. There were several off-year elections, including two in swing districts where the Democrats held very strongly. Um, so I think conventional wisdom right now is that there probably won't be uh, electoral outcomes from this income tax, but Republicans are banking on it, and that's part of the reason why you saw a 24-hour debate and more than 80 amendments offered, and why the Republicans asked for a roll call vote on almost every amendment because they want to have the record of all of those Democrats voting on those amendments. Um, so let's see. We expect, like I said, we expect the Senate to concur. We expect the governor to sign what comes in front of him. Lena asked the question about existing capital gains tax bill, and Lena, would want to go and check and make sure this is still the case. I haven't looked lately, but there was legislation moving this session, and I think it is getting across the finish line. I apologize, I don't know, that would roll back an increase to the capital gains tax that happened last session. And that is part of their plan to sort of, again, sort of equalize or change the tax structures. They want to reduce now that they have an income tax in the state, they can reduce the capital gains tax from I think it was at 25%. I think is what it got raised to recently. Yeah, so my understanding is that's still moving through. And the governor has signaled support for that position as well. So I would say the other thing that is going on this session, and particularly related to the income tax bill, is everyone is still figuring out how best to work with Governor Ferguson. That is by no means intended to be skeptical or negative about the new governor, but it has only been a year, a little over a year now, and people are still, everybody's got a different working style and different policy preferences. And so there was clearly at the beginning of his term a year ago, there was a lot of feeling that Governor Ferguson was going to his statements about taxes in particular were very moderate. I know Republicans were very disappointed when he signed last year's budget that did include those big tax increases. But I think even just his negotiating style of what we hear from legislative leaders about, he's not in there on a day-to-day basis like we would have seen a Governor Gregoire doing, where she's, there meeting with legislative leaders, negotiating policy while it's being made in the legislative process. This governor prefers to sort of make broader statements and kind of let the legislature go and try and figure out how exactly to accommodate those statements, and then, continue to make statements through the press and press releases. So it's just an interesting dynamic and something that we're all watching. This continues to play out with this income tax bill.
The the income tax bill that was passed and how do you hear me coming through?
It's okay. I can make sense of what you're saying.
Um, that's reducing other taxes as well. So I understand. And what was that final that it's been passed over to the Senate for their approval? And what about the estate tax? Has that been lowered?
So I'm not going to get all the details right because it's changed a few times, but you're right about sort of they're raising the income tax, they're lowering other taxes. They are rolling back some of the taxes that they did last year on B&O tax increases, and they are rolling back increases on sales tax for services that they imposed last year. They're also going even deeper reductions on sales tax levels for hygiene products, but that now also includes diapers. And then the version that came one of the additions that the House made was reducing the sales tax rate on over-the-counter drugs. I don't think there's any changes to the estate tax. And then, as I mentioned before, the capital gains tax reduction is made in a separate bill. So yeah, there is restructuring going on. Sort of my point about the equity versus sufficiency, they're sort of doing a little bit of both. They are restructuring the tax code, and they are also bringing more revenue in for state expenditures.
Can you talk about the capital budget? We had in the transportation and capital budgets asked for Clallam County And they were different positions on the House and the Senate, and they're working on reconciling those. How's that coming along? Have you heard?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, thanks, Colleen. That's a great segue because that was kind of my next major talking point for the morning. So as I mentioned before, the supplemental budget is usually sort of the job one in these off year, second year of the biennium. This year has been exceptional because they've been trying to rebalance things for impacts from the federal government. So one example of that has been, so big point is this supplemental budget is a much more significant supplemental budget than you typically would see. Um, One example of federal impact. So the HR 1 requires means testing for individuals to be on Medicaid. We didn't have that before, and that actually is a state requirement that we have to ensure that people getting Medicaid are below certain income limits. Um, that is something now the state is having to budget for. There's tens of millions of dollars in the both House and Senate proposed budgets for that activity. So they're having to do some of that. They also, the beginning of session, we expected pretty significant revenue shortfall. The last February revenue forecast showed that they actually were um, I'm not going to say flat, but they were slightly positive, not significantly positive. They still essentially wouldn't have had enough revenue to keep up with increases in caseloads, like kids in K through 12 schools, kids that are people that need social services, developmental disabilities, mental health services. So it would cost more money in the next 2 years to run government than what they originally budgeted for, more than the revenue they naturally would have had coming in, even though the revenue has grown a little bit. But it wasn't a whole. So these budgets we saw, so both the House and the Senate released proposed budgets in February. They have been negotiating the differences between those budgets since then. We actually expect in about an hour and a half to see the final compromise budgets, um, and expect to see a mixture of new expenditures as well as some reductions in other areas. I think, that will be somewhat consistent in terms of scale with what we previously had seen. So interesting that, they're bringing in more tax revenue. They're getting rid of some tax exemptions on data centers, for example. So that brings in more state revenue. At the same time, they're making reductions to some programs.
Recording in progress.
Um, so just a reminder, the way the budgets work, they come out of what's called a conference committee. That will happen later today. When they come out of a conference committee, it's a negotiated agreement, so there's not the opportunity for floor amendments. So basically, when we see the documents, that'll be the final deal, and then they'll pass through both chambers in the next less than 48 hours, 36 hours now about. And the governor then will have the opportunity to make decisions about whether he wants to veto any individual sections out of the budget. Um, so we specifically, with the Clallam Economic Alliance, really leaned in on the capital budget. The capital budget is where the state provides funding, a lot of which is from state bonds. So there's pretty strict requirements about it being spent on projects that can be amortized over time. They do, but they don't like to spend bond money on one-time expenditures or things that will, only last for a year operating. Um, the CEA, Clallam Economic Alliance, really leaned in supporting the Port of Port Angeles had a request that for the multi-user marine trade facility down at the port. That was included in all three, the governor's proposed budget, the House proposed budget, and the Senate proposed budget. So we have every expectation that that will be included in the final budget, which is exciting. And then the organization also leaned in to support a proposal that had a lot of regional support from both the lower Elwha tribe the city of Port Angeles, the county, the port, um, and other and the EDC, other entities to extend the wastewater line from the city of Port Angeles wastewater treatment plant to the western edge of the city's urban growth area to out to where close to the airport that would serve both the lower Elwaz public health or sorry health clinic, but also the Amazon distribution center that is slated to go in that area, and then there's additional housing. That land is some of that land is zoned for housing. So kind of a win-win-win there for lots of good economic development and other purposes. I will say, so the city of Port Angeles put in that request um, in the beginning of session. They were here in Olympia talking with legislators about that project. The Economic Alliance met the following week with Senator Chapman, Representative Birnbaum, and other legislators, and had positive discussions actually. Um, this was a late request. Legislators at the beginning of the session, when I was talking to them, didn't our legislators didn't know about it. So I think we were working from a deficit, but we were super excited when the Senate proposal came out that Senator Chapman included resources in that budget for the project at 3 million, just over $3 million. It wasn't in the House, but we didn't really expect it to be in the House. And generally speaking, when we get a project in one budget, usually we'll have a pretty good chance of getting it in the final budget. So, I wouldn't say sort of that'll be one of the first things I check when I see the documents here in a couple hours, but feeling really
Yali,
positive
where's the
about
ball? Yali, where's your ball?
that.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. I often have that question. Where did my ball go? Um, So yeah, Colleen, I think that was a long-winded way, but I wanted to cover the budgets more globally because that's a big moving piece this session. Um, I think one other global statement about the budget. You'll hear this is a Republican talking point. Don't take it as a partisan statement, but state expenditures have grown so dramatically in recent time. It really is phenomenal. This biennial budget will be getting close to $80 billion per 2 years in the operating budget, which it just was a few years ago. I remember when it broke $30 billion and thinking, wow, this is incredibly huge. Um, on the transportation side, Colleen, you asked about that. I don't continue to not really expect much exciting in the transportation budget this year. They are significantly struggling with the continuing decline of gas tax revenue. Um, it's if you're not tracking this, it's super ironic that gas prices have really gone up in Washington, and yet we're not raising as much money as we used to for gas tax revenue. Um, that is because more people are driving hybrids and electric cars and just, well, probably meetings like this that we used to drive to. People aren't on the road quite as much as they used to be. So we really are seeing a long-term continuing slide in gas tax revenue that will need to be brought up. Continued discussions about a road usage charge, or that will be an ongoing conversation.
And that was the intent of the increase in the gas tax, was to make it painful so that people would drive less.
That was the intent of the Climate Commitment Act.
Yeah.
And that impact on gas tax, yes. The idea with the carbon market is that industries will be paying into buy those credits, and that eventually, as those credits get more expensive and harder to come by, there's a financial incentive to change behavior so that you're not producing as much carbon emissions.
Well, and they talk about we tax things at a high rate that we want to discourage people from using, like cigarettes and the sugar in sodas and that kind of thing. So it seems logical to me that that would apply to gas taxes, yet we need it to maintain our roadways. And I saw DeVore on. I'm wondering if he or Matt could talk about where things are for the Simdars interchange.
My lighting's not great, but you want me to jump in, Matthew, or?
Yeah, that'd be great. I think so. DeVore's on his way up here in a couple weeks for our next city council meeting to give a legislative update. And I know that the session's not completely done yet, but he's planning on waiting to see where it lands. But yeah, he's given us kind of a heads up. And if you are comfortable with that, DeVore, feel welcome.
Yeah, as you guys know, we were very successful in getting about $30 million a couple of years ago for the US 101 Simdars bypass project. And like so many other projects, our funds were moved out to the future column. I think moved out 4 years in the House and 6 years in the Senate. And so our money is still there per WashDOT. We just can't access it. So we have a coalition that you all know about, the city, the county, the tribe, the port. Our coalition came together and said, to keep this project going, we need about 1.8 million this year. Our coalition can put together 800,000, and all we're looking for is 1 million from the legislature so we can get to 30% of design. And ask for money again next year to bring our funds back into play. We were unsuccessful in doing that. Representative Birnbaum made this his number one transportation priority, but he said there was no room to get it done this time. So we'll keep working on it. But kind of interesting, we did not come to the legislature hat in hand. We came as partners. And that wasn't even enough to get us $1 million this time around. So things are tight.
Mm-hmm.
So with that being said, hopefully we'll all be working together in the interim on this project for next session and putting a good game plan together and letting our legislators know, and possibly a new legislator, of the importance of our of this project. Thank you.
So yeah, we should talk about the Clallam Economic Alliance and how we could potentially help with that project. But anyway, yeah.
Colleen,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you can see that Commissioner French has his hand up.
Okay, I can't with my phone, so you go ahead and take it for me.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
Hi, thanks. This is great information. Two things on the transportation budget. You can correct me if I'm wrong on either of these, Josh. One, that, in a bad budget year, you don't get a lot of good news. Some good news that I saw in the transportation budgets were pavement preservation funding for WashDOT. It's something that I think many people behind the scenes have been trying to raise as an issue. When you preserve and maintain the pavement that you have, you get better roads that cost less. And so to see a significant bump, probably not what they need, but at least closer to the mark on pavement preservation was a big plus. And then the other thing I would say is, of course, I believe next week we have Adam coming here. So that might be a great time to do a deeper dive into some transportation issues.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks, Mike.
So, oh, go ahead. I have a couple other things I was going to hit, but I'm happy to
please.
keep answering questions, Colleen, if you want. I'm just
No,
filling time.
go ahead and cover your items. That'd be
Okay.
great.
The other piece I was going to mention that the Clallam Economic Alliance really had me weigh in on this year was a number of proposals from the Commissioner of Public Lands on that would impact county trust land management. And we're continuing really to see a couple of things, pressure from the public about not wanting to see timber harvest on lands that are otherwise set aside with the responsibility of generating revenue for local governments. And then a new commissioner who really is still getting his feet underneath him. And again, I don't mean that as a negative statement, it's part of the job. but also coming in with a very strong opinion that is leaning towards wanting to move away from timber harvest as an activity. So there were two bills this year, neither of which moved forward, but that we got involved in. One was a bill coming back again this year. This is the second, actually, this is the third year, I think, that there's legislation that would allow the DNR to sell ecosystem services off of trust lands. So think about either selling carbon credits or into any other environmental type of clean water or clean air, any type of system that we're set up. This has been there was actually a big report commissioned by the legislature that provided some framework for how this might work. But again, the legislature just is looking a little skeptically at this. There's a lot of support for it, but there was enough opposition concern, because the concern being that I don't think this commissioner in particular or DNR has demonstrated that this would be maintain the actual revenue production. I think the concern is that you would have, you might be getting some money off of these lands from ecosystem services, but would that make up for and be equivalent to what you get from timber harvest? So interesting to see that legislation die in both chambers. And then the second one was legislation, again, both chambers, DNR request legislation that would have added one or more tribal members to the Board of Natural Resources. And the Board of Natural Resources, if you don't know, is the entity that is composed of trust beneficiaries and statutorily has been delegated the responsibility to manage the trust lands on behalf of the beneficiaries. And really difficult and nuanced conversation about the idea that, look, there's no issue at all working with tribes. In fact, there's a lot of tribal participation, but was this really kind of a proxy for the legislature saying we want to turn the Board of Natural Resources into essentially an environmental protection entity? And ultimately that didn't move forward, but it didn't move forward because of like a fluke in the committee. There was a legislator that had a child and wasn't there for the vote the day the bill was supposed to move out of the House committee. And they didn't have the votes to get it out of committee. So that bill would have passed, but for, like I said, a fluky type of situation. So something that we'll probably see and will be coming back at us. But we saw the letter that the Clallam County
RAC,
budget advisory. Yeah, thank you.
yeah, Revenue Advisory Committee.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. They sent a letter to the legislature saying basically, it's time for the legislature to reassert its responsibility as trust beneficiaries, because we don't feel confident that the DNR is doing that job. So I just think there will be a lot more conversation over coming months and years about sort of trust land management. And I really see Clallam County in particular being pretty far ahead, I think, of the rest of the state in terms of understanding the impact and what the legal relationship is between the trust beneficiaries and the state. So that will continue to be something I think that we're talking about.
Skagit and Pacific counties are also engaging now pretty heavily in that space as well. So the ecosystem bill that didn't move out of the House Natural Resources Committee, I know that's not the exact name, but where the policy is addressed at the committee level, would that ecosystem bill have affected all the three types of trust lands that DNR manages, to include the county trust lands?
Yes.
Okay. And so that allowed for up to 125-year leases that would basically say you don't harvest, and since you didn't harvest, you've locked away carbon emissions. But, there's also the point that at some point trees begin to decay and release emissions. So there's a big scientific debate over how much value there is in not harvesting those trees from a carbon sequestration perspective. But it definitely, I've been told, and I don't know if this is accepted, but that the lease for carbon credits would only generate about 10% of the value to the beneficiaries, like the schools in the junior taxing districts, roads, county, port, libraries, etc. 10% compared to if there was an actual harvest. Would you say that's a given assessment, or is that also debated?
I think you could make that statement about a particular point in time, right? Because the carbon markets are always fluctuating like any market does. I know I work with I represent private forest landowners as well, who have participated in the voluntary carbon market. So companies that are interested in being able to, demonstrate that they're reducing their carbon footprint by purchasing leases. It is not the money right now is not there. It's not equal to what you would get from timber harvest. A lot of that, Colleen, I think is gonna depend hugely not just on the markets, but like log values and
Yeah.
inflation over time. But I think generally speaking, so I can't say about the specific dollar amount that you had, but I think that as a general statement, carbon markets, environmental markets are not generating an equivalent amount of revenue that the timber production markets are, and that is the concern.
Mm-hmm.
There was a version of this bill came out originally. It was either 3 years ago or 4 years ago, and it was heavily negotiated and almost passed. And one of the things that negotiated version of the bill did was put in a requirement that there had to be equivalent revenue generated. The commissioner, for whatever reason, introduced a bill that went back to sort of what it was before it was negotiated by the legislature. And then they never made additional changes. Well, they never added that provision to this version of the bill, which was part of the major concern.
Okay, so there had been a piece saying it had to create the same amount of revenues, but then that was stripped. And so they want it back in.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, which of course that would help the junior taxing districts, but that doesn't help the economies that rely on log supply.
That is also the case. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know former Senator Ann Rivers and let's see, Bruce Beckett and Jim Buck are working on, some kind of solutions. And also Ted Sturdivant that works for us through our Clallam Forest Products Innovation Program and the Rockefeller Foundation are working with DNR, specifically Paula Sweden, if I said her name right. Swedeen? I never say it right. Swedeen, I'm going to get it right. Trying to figure out how could we potentially find some solutions that could work for both the needs of Clallam County and what DNR wants to see. But, we're not willing to reduce the economic demand and need from our timber harvests. So anyway, there's conversations happening, which is good.
Yeah, it is good.
That's where solutions start. Not that they're easy, but if you're not doing that, you're not moving forward.
Yep, absolutely. And I think that was a lot of frustration speaking, for a broad sentiment that was expressed in the hearings on the ecosystem services bill was just the sort of lack of discussion prior to the introduction of the bill and lack of collaboration. Like it really what very much was hey, throw the bill out there and see if we can push it through, which is, I would say, very much the way the legislature has begun operating more and more, is less around wanting to work issues, acknowledging that maybe a bill is introduced isn't perfect and needs some tweaking or changing, and just the idea that we're gonna. So I'm maybe shifting gears a little bit to elections, but I just saw that we saw this week that Senator Jamie Peterson, who is the Senate Majority Leader, and I think by everybody's account would say a liberal Democrat from Seattle, um, and he's drawn a challenger from the left this year. And one of the criticisms they had for him was that the challenger has for him is that he's a quote unquote corporate incrementalist. And so this idea that change happens incrementally over time and, with tweaks and perfection over time, that is very much not appreciated by this sort of new progressive brand of legislators that have come into the legislature and are wanting to come into the legislature. And we've been seeing that since COVID. Yeah.
Are there any Republican representatives or senators out of King County?
Yes, there are still 3 from, I think it's the 31st district, which includes part of Auburn and part of King County. And that would be Drew Stokesbury, who's the House Minority Leader. I can't remember the other House member, sorry, but and then Phil Fortunato is the senator there.
Okay.
Yeah, but they're the last ones. And actually, I
Okay.
mentioned before that there was a swing district race this last fall. One of those was in the 5th district, which is Eastern King County, the Snoqualmie, Issaquah area, and Republicans that's the district that Dino Rossi came from. Was traditionally a moderate Republican district that has been turning bluer. Republicans were trying to hold on to, trying to gain back a seat there, and they were not able to do that. That is now entirely a blue district. So that's the suburbs, in King County are really the example of how the demographics and the politics in the state have changed, particularly since the Trump years. Those districts are just not voting Republican anymore.
Yeah. Yep.
I was gonna say, I wanted to touch briefly on elections, just that we are going into an election year. This is the time of session when we all like to sit around TVW and watch what's happening on the floors, because this is when people stand up sort of in the middle of other bill action or in breaks between bill action and will say, point of personal privilege, and they'll announce to the chamber and to the rest of the world that they're not going to run again. I think we've seen the legislature has been trending over time to turn over a lot more frequently. Have heard a number of retirements already. We're expecting to hear just over the next 2 days, lots more. And I think everybody's sort of wondering. I don't have any inside information, but everybody's wondering whether Representative Herringer is going to come back or not. So we'll see.
So would you say just as many Republicans as Democrats are announcing their retirement, or is it more swinging one way or another? Because I would think it would not be fun to be a Republican right now, because you're not in the majority. You have and you can't even really stop things that you disagree with. It's like you're a speed bump.
It's interesting. So no, I'm just looking at the list that I have so far. I would say it's pretty well split between Republicans and Democrats. I think so this is maybe some conjecture on my part, but it's conjecture that I would say that I have colleagues that share. But depending on a person's temperament and what they think is fun, I think that being a Republican deep in the minority actually is a lot less stressful and a lot more enjoyable than being a Democrat in leadership for a couple of reasons. One is just that, when you're in the minority, your job, especially this deep of a minority, your job is essentially to be, to obviously to get things done for your district as you can, but also like essentially from a big perspective, just to sort of be problematic for the majority. There's not a lot of pressure, and people don't really expect results. Um, when you're in leadership, you have to deliver. Like the fact that the House went 24 hours on the debate, like Democratic majority owns that. Um, they didn't work this weekend. There's a lot of people sitting outside the doors saying, boy, why didn't they split that up between 2 days? Um, it's easy for us to sit on the sidelines and ask those questions, right? The other thing about the Democratic caucuses, I think more in the House and less in the Senate, but in both caucuses for sure, is that there's a lot more inter-party fighting. There's a lot more tension between, the handful of moderate Democrats who don't want to vote for an income tax. Um, there's a lot of, we hear stories from those caucus discussions that are just ugly, ugly, ugly fights and interpersonal conflicts that develop because of that. So I think that it's this is where the speculation comes in, although it's based on comments, but I don't think it's a very fun place for some people to be. Um,
Hmm.
it's more
What?
consequential. They're getting things done, but if
Yeah.
you're sort of not on the fully on the train, it's not very fun.
So what would you say is driving this tension that is worse this year than it's been in prior years?
Yeah, I made the comment before we started the recording that this was one of for me, and I think for most of my colleagues, one of the least enjoyable sessions I think many of us have had. Legislators are not in a very good mood, I think, and this is a generalization. It doesn't apply to individuals necessarily, and an observation from the outside. But, Democrats, I think for the most part, in a good chunk of Democrats are really, really their constituency is very concerned about what's happening in Washington, D.C. They have a lot of angst about that, and they feel the need to respond to their constituents, even though there's not really very much they can do. So I think they feel, stuck. Um, and then I think Republicans, we just talked about not being in majority, not being in control, not being able to influence very much. I think they see the policy direction that the state is going and are just very concerned. So, as a broad generalization, I think that's part of it. I think, as I mentioned before, I think there is in both parties, what you see happening nationally is playing out here in the state. You have extremes that want to push the parties very hard, either to the right or to the left, and there's tension about that. I think you see it more here on the left than you do the right because I don't think the Republican feel it's so obvious here electorally that President Trump and Trumpism is not popular. And so I think it's easier for moderate Republicans to say to their colleagues who are getting pressured from the grassroots to say, that might be true, but it's not going to win us any seats. We just can't go that direction.
Hmm.
But they are getting pressure from the grassroots as well. And I think the grassroots has gotten more vocal, right?
Yeah.
The model we have nationally now is much more about contention and fighting and wanting to get it all in one bite rather than taking little bites over time.
So I was listening to the news about, I think it's called Save America Act or America Save Act that President Trump wants passed. And one of the provisions I heard about was that it will prevent mail-in ballots, which our state, of course, is 100% mail-in ballots. So if that passes, would that mean that we all have to go to the polls from here on out to vote for all
I don't,
elections?
yeah, I don't know. I believe that that will be litigated. I know our Secretary of State is in conflict with the federal government over this. I have heard, don't quote me on this because I haven't looked at it myself, but my understanding is that those decisions are made at the state level and that the federal government, there's states' rights issue there, federal government not having the authority to tell states how to run their elections. But again, I think that'll be litigated and that'll be super contentious.
Yeah. Not that this state votes Republican at the federal level very often, but or recently, but so maybe they just the politicos on the Republican side at the federal level just have disregarded Washington's concerns. I know I sure like voting by mail and not having to go to a poll.
I think that's a general Washingtonian view, right? I think for the most part, we feel pretty good about our election system here.
It's much more convenient.
Yeah. Oh, Ed doesn't like it. Okay. There's diversity out there for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I say those things and it's always like, this is from my bubble. This is the impression I have, but it's not scientific.
Yeah. If I can get something done without having to wait in line, I just hate waiting in line. Always have had a real aversion to that, whether it's a grocery store or at the airport.
It's very American of you.
Yeah.
Me too. I mean, I'm not casting stones.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yes, this only voted once in person. I think I voted once or twice when I was younger at the ballot before it went to vote by mail. And then I was in law school for a couple of years. So.
Okay, well, are there any other questions for Josh? If I'm not, I'm looking at the chat. So Lena says she always preferred to go to the ballot box. Yeah, I've actually never done it because I was in the military and then Washington. So yeah, or I was an army brat over in Germany, so voted by mail that way too. So let's see, it's 8:55 and sounds like we have come to the end of our discussion, so we'll give you guys 4 minutes back. And Josh, thank you so much for providing us this update. And when the budget, capital and transportation budgets come out, I will put it out in the newsletter. We'll do a special one when we get it from Josh, so everybody will see what projects were funded by the legislature for our county. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all your time and your work on our behalf. You do an exceptional job. So thank you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.